Firstly, given where I live as the Dean of Law and the significant relationship between the Kingitanga and the iwi of Tauranga Moana, I acknowledge Te Ariki Nui, Kuini Ngā Waihono i Te Pō, and Mana Whenua of Tauranga Moana. We are delighted to be partnering with Tompkins Wake for the Tompkins Wake Annual Public Lecture at this beautiful Tauranga Moana campus, University of Waikato. Welcome to everyone who is here this evening. I would like to thank Tompkins Wake for this event and our esteemed speaker, Yo Mana Lifts Te Piringa o Laupulelea. As you know, Te Piringa was established in 1991 on 3 founding pillars: biculturalism, professionalism, and the study of law in context. This annual event adds to Te Piringa's reputation and mana because it is our connection to the profession which cements and furthers our commitment to our founding pillars. And here at our Tauranga campus, students can now complete their entire LLB degree, and we have a growing cohort of academic staff based in Tauranga. So we are committed to growing our presence and supporting our Tauranga students. Exciting things are happening at the University of Waikato. We were recently ranked 235 in the world by QS World University Rankings, the 3rd highest ranking in New Zealand. And that is due to your support. So thank you. Now, before I sit down and hand it over to James, a partner at Tompkins Wake, just a few housekeeping matters. Our restrooms and fire exits are in the same direction towards the back of the room to your right. I'll remind you this is a no smoking campus, and can I please also remind you to either turn off your phones or put them to silent during the lecture. Whaftai and soifua.
E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā iwi. E mihi ana au ki ngā tangata whenua o Tauranga Moana, ngā mihi mō tō manakitanga. E mihi ana hoki au ki ngā koutou katoa kua pai mai nei I te pō nei. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is James McGilvray, and on behalf of Tompkins Wake, in partnership with Te Piringa Faculty of Law, it's my great pleasure to introduce this year's lecture. I acknowledge distinguished guests with us this evening. Vice-Chancellor Neil Quigley, I hope he's arrived. He was running late, but if he hasn't, hopefully he'll get here. Chair of Ngai Te Rangi Iwi, Charlie Tawhio, kia ora tā. Her Worship Mayor Faylene Tunui of Kawerau District Council, His Worship Mayor James Denyer of Western Bays District Council, His Honour Judge de Jong, Chair of the Bay of Plenty Regional Council, Doug Leader, Councillor Rod Taylor from Tauranga City Council, and of course, last but not least, the Honourable Christopher Finlayson KC. Through our sponsorship of this lecture series, Tompkins Wake aims to support and enhance the work of Te Piringa Faculty of Law in Tauranga Moana, as well as fostering a positive, critical engagement with the law and legal issues in 21st century Aotearoa. It's our legal obligation as lawyers to uphold the rule of law, and if the rule of law is to be upheld, we need people to care about the values underpinning the law and to engage positively and critically with legal issues in an informed way. We've been blessed by the calibre of speakers in this lecture since it's the inaugural lecture in 2021. So far we've had Justice Susan Gladesbrook, the Chief Justice, Dame Helen Wynne-Kelman, last year Natalie Coates, speaking about tikanga, and our guest lecturer this year continues to uphold the mana and the quality of speaker that we've been blessed with. He has a distinguished career not only as a lawyer but also as a politician. Wellington born and educated, Chris was a partner at Brandon Brookfields in the late 80s to 1990, and then from 91 to 2002 at Bell Gully, where he acted as a young partner for Ngāi Tahu in a series of court cases that led to his client's groundbreaking treaty settlement with the Crown in 1997. Chris was first elected to Parliament as a National MP in 2005, and from 2008 to 2017 served first under John Key, then Bill English, as Attorney General and as Minister for Treaty of Waitangi Negotiations. He also served shorter periods as Minister for Arts, Culture and Heritage, Minister responsible for our spies, and Associate Minister for Māori Development. In 2013, as Attorney General, he represented New Zealand in the International Court of Justice at The Hague, where New Zealand intervened in Australia's suit against Japan, seeking to stop commercial whaling in the Southern Ocean. After retiring as an MP in 2019, Chris rejoined the bar and practices from Bankside Chambers in Auckland. Since leaving politics, he's also had time to write 2 excellent books about his key roles in government: Yes Minister, on his role as Attorney General, and He Kupu Taurangi, on treaty settlements. Both would make excellent Christmas gifts for your friends and family. But on a more serious note, if more people could read He Kupu Taurangi, our public discourse on matters relating to the treaty would be greatly improved, because it's a terrific book. And Chris's legal and political career, and in particular his very important work as Minister for Treaty and Negotiations, I think stands as an example of what can be achieved when tolerance, goodwill and open-mindedness are combined with a sense of fairness and a desire for justice. So it's my very, very great pleasure to ask you to help me to welcome him up.
Raurangatira mā tēnei taku mihi atu kia koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm so honoured to be asked to give this lecture. Earlier this year, Victoria University asked me to give the Lucretia Seals lecture in honour of Lucretia, whom some of you may have or may remember, took a very principled stand on the End to Life legislation. And to be asked to speak here, given the previous speakers, fills me with trepidation. But before I talk about that, can I simply acknowledge the University of Waikato. The Vice-Chancellor, whom I've known for many years, would be very disappointed if I didn't say he was an outstanding Vice-Chancellor, leading the university into a great future. And of course, one of the jewels in the crown is this particular law faculty, which in the last 34 or so years has grown to play such an important role in legal education in New Zealand. And I acknowledge the Dean, and I had no idea. I mentioned to her a few weeks ago, I had been up in Apia for a case in the Constitutional Court. She knew exactly what villages were involved and what the issues were. So she's a dean who's right on top of things. And I did say to her, and to one of her colleagues who teaches private international law, or the conflict of laws, which has always been my favourite subject, and I helped teach it at Victoria. She said there's a bit of a gap in the curriculum there, so I've offered my services to the law faculty, teaching choice of law and tort and forum convenience and all sorts of other interesting subjects, because it is such a magnificent subject. Can I also acknowledge Tompkins' wake? James told me that when he came back from Freshfields to go to the firm, it was still a relatively small firm. Well, it now has a floor in my building where Bankside Chambers is in Shortland Street, and it's growing here, and it is one of the bigger law firms in the country with a huge reputation. And I think it's a sign of their contribution to this community that it takes part and sponsors this very important lecture. I said I was filled with trepidation because on the way in, Marcus told me who had given the great address over the years. I wasn't too worried about the Chief Justice with respect. Susan Glazebrook terrifies me. But it was Natalie Coates who worried me because Catherine Cook from Tompkins Wake and I were trying to organise the itinerary, and I said, well, I'm in court at the moment, and I just hope I can get my submissions through. I've been acting for Rangitane o Manawatu, an interested party in a Maka case, which covers the coastline from Kapiti to Manawatu. And one of the counsel acting is Natalie Coates, who is representing Ngāti Rokawa, based in Otaki. And so I finished my submissions. She was about to start, but I ran out the door to come up here. But she is a formidable opponent and a person with a tremendous future ahead of her. So I hope that I don't fail you tonight with my address, and I hope I don't fame anyone. Can I also acknowledge, just to show you, A, I'm getting old, but B, the memory's not all that bad. Can I acknowledge someone in the audience tonight I haven't seen for, it must be well over 30 years, retired Judge Lindsay Moore. And I appeared before him, and he told me and I'm sure he won't mind my telling you his age, he's 85 and retired now. He was from Davies, Burton, Henderson and Moore, went on the bench years ago, there he is up there. And I appeared before him in a very interesting case, which he instantly remembered. Maybe it was because of my crummy submissions. But it was a person who was, a very sad story, chopping trees or trimming trees. And there was a huge power line, an interprovincial power line going through, and he came within the arc around the actual line and was electrocuted and died, and so we had to deal with that issue. But it's great to see you again, and it was always a pleasure to appear before you because, well, you never yelled at people, you were always thoroughly pleasant, and you let us get away with blue murder. So some people say, why are you talking about Precipice? Well, let me tell you why. A couple of months ago, I was in London and visited one of my favourite haunts, Hatchard's bookshop in Piccadilly. The primary purpose for my visit to Hatchard's was to find a book I could read on the long flight back, and we've all done that before. I did purchase Shalom Lapin's latest book, The New Anti-Semitism, The Resurgence of an Ancient Hatred in the Modern World, a topic which both greatly disturbs and interests me, but with respect to Mr. Lapin, I didn't think I could cope with reading a book on the ancient lethal obsession for 12,000 miles. Then I came across the recently published book by Robert Harris entitled Precipice. And maybe it's his background in journalism, but frankly, Harris's books have always been to me extremely readable. As you know, they take us from ancient Rome, his brilliant Cicero trilogy, to an alternative history of the Second World War, Fatherland, to the hunt for the men who signed the death warrant of Charles I, Act of Oblivion. He's a master of engaging with the facts, but does so in a readable and an enjoyable way. So I purchased Precipice, and for 12,000 miles I read and enjoyed the book. As some of you may know, and look, thank you for the exhortation to people to buy my two books for a Christmas present. I'm not Robert Harris's agent, but I may, buy it and read it at Ohope. As some of you may know, it's set in the summer of 1914, that improbably glorious summer before the Great War opened a chasm in the world. Harris had access to many documents in the possession of the Bonham Carter family, and through those documents he constructed what I thought was a brilliant novel, not only about a clandestine love affair, but also about the emerging chaos of the world. The story centres around the relationship between Prime Minister Herbert Asquith and the Honourable Venetia Stanley, who was the daughter of Lord and Lady Sheffield. Although only 26, she's in the midst of a romantic engagement with a 61-year-old Liberal Prime Minister. Every day the Prime Minister wrote to her. How he found time for personal letters escapes me. Ireland was on the verge of revolution and a European war was on the horizon. And the novel describes the dazzling life of Venetia and how a Prime Minister faced with so many problems managed to spare time each day to write to her. As war breaks out and the political wrangling over military strategy commences, we see the unveiling of a world disaster. So this is a novel about love, it's a novel about power, about how the son of northern nonconformists rose to the highest seat in the land. It's a story which reminds us once again that in the lead up to the First World War, the great statespeople and monarchs of the age committed a litany of errors and plunged the world into a catastrophe. The promise in 1914 was that, quote, the boys would be home for Christmas. But that was a foolish prediction. The survivors returned home some 4 years later, their lives ruined, their lives destroyed. And as we know, that wasn't the end, but merely the prelude to the continuation of the First World War in those dreadful years, 1939 to 45. That is why, and it surprises some of my right-wing friends, that I'm a great supporter of the conscientious objectors who took a principled stand against the madness of the First World War. For some years I was a trustee of the Archibald Baxter Memorial Trust and was delighted when former Deputy Prime Minister Grant Robertson dedicated the memorial some years ago. It's just off George Street in Dunedin, and its development caused controversy all those years later. There were numerous white feathers left at the memorial the day it was dedicated. So Precipice is a good read, a reminder of how the world almost sleptwalked into a cataclysm. Little steps may not mean very much, but they can lead, and in the case of the years 1914, did lead the world into a disaster. So this is the inspiration for my speech tonight, because, to put it bluntly, if we're not careful, then I think we'll end up on a precipice and could find ourselves in an environment no one either wanted or expected a couple of years ago. I don't intend to be a Jeremiah and list all the possible areas where things could go wrong, but having been Attorney General and Minister for Treaty of Waitangi Negotiations, I want to spend some time on two topics. First, race relations, and secondly, the relationship between Parliament and the judiciary. For 9 years, I was so very lucky to be the Minister for Treaty of Waitangi Negotiations. Like the Honourable Sir Michael Cullen before me, I regarded it as the most interesting portfolio I had, although I have to confess, and I can't tell you anything, the spooks were indeed interesting as well. I was very fortunate to have a supportive Minister of Finance in Bill English and a really interested and supportive Prime Minister in John Key. In those years, the Key National Government achieved a great deal. This was a continuation of the work of Helen Clark's administration, and before that the Bolger administration, which had started the historical process in the 1990s. It's always been bipartisan, and both national and Labour governments can be pleased with what they have achieved. We all know that the historical treaty settlement process is not perfect. For one thing, the most powerful institution in the land, the Crown, seems to hold all the cards when negotiating with iwi. It was my experience, however, that skilled negotiators often achieved far more than they could have expected when the negotiations began. For example, Tamati Kruger was a masterful negotiator for Ngāi Tūhoe, and managed to persuade the Crown that Te Urewera should be taken out of the National Parks regime, given its own legal personality, and that Tūhoe should run it. There are many examples of that across the Motu. What I want to emphasise this evening is that those settlements have been highly successful, and I want to point you to a number of examples. First, Rokawa, not Natalie's client in Otaki, but the Rokawa based in Tokoroa. Its rohe is the southern Waikato. Rokawa Iwi Development Limited is the commercial and investment arm of Rokawa. Its role is to manage the settlement Putia to ensure that Rokawa have adequate financial resources to support its iwi members. Its initial settlement was $50 million in land claims, with payment made in 2012. Participation in the Waikato River iwi settlement that delivered about $30 million spread through payments over 14 years. And participation in the CNI iwi forestry tree lord settlement, which gave Rokawa a stake in the land underlying Kaingaroa Forest and access to rentals. I just want to tell you what they have achieved since settlement. Over the period 2013 to 2024 inclusive, the development arm of Rokawa has delivered an internal rate of return of about 8.1% per annum. This performance is not only well beyond what one might earn in interest at the bank or what funding would cost the Crown, but it's also substantially above balanced KiwiSaver funds, which take equivalent risks and have tended to return 5 to 6% over the last decade. Total distributions to Rokawa of around $41 million, and a growth to the balance sheet to over $250 million. Quite apart from economic development, Rokawa has continued to provide health and social services to the communities who live within its takiwā. These services include transition to adulthood, supporting rangatahi who have been in state care to transition to independence, mental health services for adults, chronic conditions services, kaumātua services, kaupapa Māori and Western therapeutic service, which supports whānau to keep their tamariki out of state care, and that's just some of it. The iwi also has a number of partnerships with the Crown, which are delivering very, very good results. So Rokawa has always aspired to uphold themselves in their relationship with their people, their communities, their whenua and waterways through the values that underpin rangatiratanga. Rangatiratanga to Rokawa is not about asserting authority, but is about leadership, about being responsible to others and for others, about being able to bring people together and maintain and enhance the well-being of both people and the land. They're wonderful, wonderful people, and as long as I live, I will never forget the day as minister they took me in a bus around the rohe, from the Kaimais through to Te Awamutu, the wonderful, kind, gentle people who have achieved so much for their people and the broader community in South Waikato. Let me also talk about an iwi at the other end of the country. I've acknowledged I've been acting for them in the Maka hearing, Rangitane o Manawatu. Rangitane settled in 2016 with a relatively small quantum of about 13.5 million. Today the asset base is about 21 million. It's asset rich and cash poor. If one includes other Rangitane representative entities, one adds another 13 million or so to the keti. The investment trust has always taken a conservative approach, mainly investing in the property market. They've done a number of joint ventures in Palmerston North, for example, with the Quest Hotel. Once again, this is an iwi which has provided wonderful social services in its community. They've been a provider of whānau ora, health and wellbeing services since 1993, not needing to wait for their settlement to begin the pathway, but more so leveraging of various government policies. And their services include a general medical practice, whānau ora practice nurses, breast screen health promotion, nutrition and physical activities program, smoking treatment, cancer care coordinators, financial mentors, employment hubs, food banks, and so many more. They've built an excellent relationship with the Palmerston North City Council and the Horizons Regional Council. They've been working with the community to improve the Manawatu Awa. They've developed pass sites along the river and have recently launched He Hara Kotahi, where one can click on a QR code along the river and learn a lot of the history of both the Awa and Rangitane. So from a very low commercial base, Rangitane have worked incredibly well over the last decade. They want to exercise their rangatiratanga without the Crown telling people what is best. They're not asking for handouts. They're simply asking the Crown to work honourably with them by listening to them and supporting their pathways. There are so many other examples I could give of iwi that are doing great things, particularly following their historical treaty settlements. The point I want to make is that these iwi are making a significant commercial and social contribution to New Zealand and are working hard in their communities to complement the work of Crown agencies, and so often they're more effective than Crown agencies. It's often said that if this country's not careful, we could be in a similar economic position to Argentina by about 2050. So it baffles me that so many people regard or look at iwi in a negative light, regard iwi with suspicion, regard the legitimate aspirations as tangata whenua as something to worry about rather than something to rejoice in. Iwi commercial enterprises are generally excellent, and we should be supporting them as major contributors to the new economy. We should also be recognising the significant social and community role they play. The Crown has to understand that the settlement commitments don't end when the settlement legislation receives its third reading in Parliament. If there's one phrase I hate, it's that if someone says to me, oh, well, that settlement's done and dusted. It's never done and dusted. The obligations continue. That's why I set up the Post-Settlement Commitments Unit in 2014. Its purpose was to develop a register of commitments and make sure that those commitments are understood and honoured by all Crown agencies into the future, and that also include, well, not the local government's an agency of the Crown, but I think local government also has access to the register of commitments. As you may be aware, the major problem with the Crown is so often it has no institutional memory. That's why the unit was established. And when Kelvin Davis became the Minister for Crown Maori Relations, he built on my work and developed Te Arawhiti. And that agency has done an excellent job, and I commend Kelvin for that initiative. That's why I'm disturbed at the proposal to disband Te Arawhiti and transfer its functions to Te Puni Kokiri, the Ministry for Maori Development. I don't think TPK understands the important mandate of Te Arawhiti, and I don't think it will do a particularly good job upholding Crown treaty commitments into the future. So far as I understand, the primary responsibility for upholding treaty commitments is going to be done in TPK regional offices. It won't work. In my experience, and I say this advisedly, TPK was always an incompetent ministry. After I became Associate Minister of Maori Affairs, I asked John Key, for example, if I could reform Te Turi Whenua Māori, because John Luxton, who had been minister in the 1990s, said it needed to be reformed and told me that the settings weren't quite right. And so John Key said, go for it. This reform was an opportunity to address a very difficult question about making tangata whenua land more productive. PwC had published a report some years earlier that said if Māori land could be made more productive, it could, with inputs of a couple of $2 billion, contribute more than $6 billion to the Māori economy. I would have thought it was worth the investment. TPK had no ability to deal with the issue, and so policy support had to be provided to it so that this important take could be addressed. I don't think the change to disband Te Ara Whiti is a good one. It has some simply outstanding civil servants. I always used to refer to them, or the people in the Office of Treaty Settlements, as the Jesuits of the civil service. Many of them are going to lose their jobs or be transferred into the wasteland of TPK. And I feel very sorry for them, because I think the work they did was extremely important and that what is happening is simply wrong. The greatest threat to treaty settlements is the Crown, and the fact, as I have said, that it has no institutional memory. To give you an illustration of that, I remember during the Kermadex debate, meeting with officials from the Ministry for the Environment, and you may recall that we were kicking up a fuss about essentially FMA 10 being part of the Kermadex reserve. And I said to the officials, could you tell me about your understanding of the 1992 fisheries settlement? And they looked at me the way a Jersey cow looks at you, extraordinary vacancy. They had no idea about what I was talking about. And that's why Te Ara Whiti is important. You can't delegate those tasks to the regional offices of TPK. That you need an organisation like Te Ara Whiti with its eye on the ball. And in private life, since leaving Parliament, there have been a number of occasions when iwi have contacted me and said, oh, the settlement's defective in some respects, what do we do about it? Woodburn Air Force Base is an example because of PFAS. And you could go to Te Ara Whiti, engage with the Minister for Crown Māori Relations, and things were sorted out thanks to what Kelvin did in that particular case. As a result of the coalition agreement drawn up between the three parties, a number of legislative reforms were initiated in 2023. The reform to the Marine and Coastal Act 2011 following the decision of the Court of Appeal in the Edwards case. Several members of the coalition were appalled at what they thought was the deliberate reading down of the requirements of Section 58 of MACA. I don't intend to say too much about this topic tonight because the Supreme Court has today just begun hearing the appeal from the Court of Appeal, and it would be inappropriate to comment on something which is very much a live issue before the court. What I can say, however, is that legislating at the same time before all levels of appeal have been heard is unusual and not necessarily desirable. It goes without saying that Parliament can legislate to respond to a negative judicial decision. Some years ago, the Supreme Court delivered a decision which the then Speaker Lockwood Smith said raised an important question of privilege. It concerned the way the Supreme Court had treated parliamentary privilege in a matter before it concerning defamation. The Privileges Committee, which I chaired, thought the Supreme Court had got it wrong, and we decided that we needed to clarify the law of parliamentary privilege. So Parliament passed the Parliamentary Privilege Act 2014, which is being incorporated in the Parliament Bill, which is currently being considered by Parliament. The point is that the reform occurred after the Supreme Court decision and was done in a careful and deliberate manner. There was no rush to legislate. As I said to someone the other day, when the Foreshore and Seabed Act was passed, about 20,000 people marched on Parliament. When the Marine and Coastal Act was in its final legislative stages, about 100 people marched on Parliament. The issue had been settled down. All parties in the Parliament at that time, New Zealand First was not there, dealt with the issue professionally. And I particularly acknowledge and commend David Parker, who as Shadow Attorney General detoxified the argument, refused to indulge in argument by epithet, dealt with the matter for his party in a very responsible and measured way. And I have a lot of time for David Parker, and I received the rank of KC when I represented the New Zealand and the ICJ. Judith received it a little while ago, and I really think David Parker was a very good Attorney General, and he too deserves the rank. The government's indicated it wishes to introduce legislation to provide greater guidance for the court on treaty clauses. The Minister of Justice has expressed concern about provisions like Section 4 of the Conservation Act that provides that those administering the Act shall have regard to the principles of the treaty. He says such general clauses are unacceptable and greater precision is required. Well, there's nothing new here. I spent some time talking about careful drafting of legislation in my first speech to Parliament, and as Attorney General I was always insistent that generalised provisions were unsatisfactory. Every time I considered a treaty clause, I refused to have the general approach but preferred the specific. For example, when the Historic Places Act was reformed in 2014, I insisted on a specific provision. So one not get that bill is on the either on the verge of or is about or has been introduced. I'm not too concerned about that, although the minister's not the first one to have considered the need for careful drafting. And as you all know, the treaty principles legislation has excited much debate throughout the land. I agree with those who say the legislation is foolish and misconceived. It seems to proceed on the basis that the treaty is one between races, which is wrong. It's one between the Crown and tangata whenua. It should never have been agreed to. It's going to cause huge hurt throughout the land. A coalition agreement is nowhere as important as a treaty between the Crown and Maori. I can really do no more than what the First Minister of Treaty Negotiations said in a recent letter to the Herald, and I do want to quote. He talks about the Titi Islands. The Titi Islands are situated just south of Rakiura, Stewart Island. For many centuries, Ngāi Tahu members visited the island to harvest mutton birds, and do so to this day. Similar food gathering activities occurred throughout New Zealand by local Maori members. The right to do this was recognised by the English common law when European settlement began, known as customary rights. They were confirmed by the treaty and survived whatever powers were transferred to the British Crown by the treaty. Such customary rights, therefore, were not created by the treaty and remain in existence until either abandoned or extinguished by legislation. Once lost, they can't be recovered. Accordingly, the Ngāi Tahu Treaty Settlement in 1998 acknowledged this position and confirmed their exclusive right to harvest mutton birds. If, as Act suggests, all New Zealanders must have equal rights, then in the future, everybody can harvest mutton birds, or Ngāi Tahu's rights would need to be extinguished by legislation with compensation paid for the loss. It's difficult to see any benefit to anyone from that. In the 1980s, Doug says, Parliament inserted the phrase, the principles of the treaty in legislation, and invited the courts to declare what they were. For the past 40 years, it's tried to do that, so the intention of the parties in 1840 can be fulfilled today. The courts have held that the treaty gave the government the right to introduce its policies, required parties to act in the utmost good faith, obliged the government to consult with tangata whenua over any matters which affected them, and pay compensation if there were breaches. In its attempt to follow the principles, the government over the past few years has introduced practices and procedures which many find unacceptable. And this is the reference to the previous government. These include giving preference to Māori over other Kiwi in the provision of some health services, and in the case of potable water, giving Māori the sole ability to decide what constituted acceptable water standards. But it's not the principles which are the problem, rather it's the way they've been used to justify certain policy positions. Why it is necessary then to change the principles is hard to fathom. And then majestically he says, the treaty was a declaration of goodwill by the Crown and Maori. Endless debate over the words and differing versions doesn't really help when most fair-minded Kiwi regard each other with respect and wish each other well. Nor is it helpful for Maori leaders to continually blame colonisation. The fact colonisation occurred is not going to change. We need to appreciate that we are all different with distinctive cultures and sometimes specific needs. Tangata whenua, as our indigenous people, have a very special place, and we would all be the poorer without it. Finally, he says the ACT Party claims that no other country is successful when it treats its citizens differently due to their particular race. That is nonsense. Amongst others in Sweden, the Sami reindeer people, the First Nation bands of Canada and the United States, and the Aboriginal tribes in Australia have all recognised rights protected by law. As countries, they are no less successful than we are. We are blessed to live in this beautiful country and able to debate issues freely. In doing so, we should do so respectfully. But I can't add to that because I agree with everything he said. There's a side to me that says introduce the bill, refer it to a select committee, and then annihilate it through the power of argument. But it's fair to say, and I keep pretty good contact with all my buddies in various iwi around the country, that it's really hurting. It seems to be a hostile and unnecessary act. Many years ago, as part of the confidence and supply arrangement with New Zealand First, Helen Clark agreed to something similar. New Zealand First MP Doug Woollerton introduced legislation to delete all the provisions of the treaty from legislation. The legislation was garbage, but it received a first reading and then was voted down after it was returned from a select committee. I was on the Justice Select Committee at the time. It was fairly obvious from day one the bill had been badly drafted, was incoherent, and should not proceed. There are some who say, well, if it was good enough for Helen to agree to something like this, why not Luxon? I think the point is that things have moved on so much since the early 2000s that, coupled with all the other changes which have been introduced since 2023, it's seen as a hostile act. The world is a different place. The circumstances are different. That is why, in my opinion, the bill and the fact of the bill is going to have serious retrograde consequences for the community. So what I've endeavoured to show, and there's a lot more I could say, but by reference to those matters, in the first part of this address is that if we're not on the precipice, we're in danger of heading in that direction. In many areas of governmental activity, there's a perception of hostility toward iwi and Māori. If we're not careful, we run the risk that things could unravel very quickly indeed. In particular, treaty settlements may not be regarded as full and final. If the Crown's cavalier about recognising its commitments under settlement legislation, then why should people regard them as full and final? The Macca situation is serious for the reasons expressed, but I've got to be careful what I say. The Treaty Principles Bill has the potential to cause huge damage. There are other issues I could refer to, but they're the main ones at the present time. It seems so unfortunate, given the very good space we were in a few years ago. Settled iwi are achieving so much, not only for their members, but for the wider community. They're huge contributors to New Zealand, with the potential to contribute even more. The increased use of te reo seems to upset a few people, but this is an inevitable development we should all be so pleased about. I remember meeting Sana Murray of Ngāti Kuri and Ngāti Kahu a couple of years ago. She told me how she was beaten at primary school for speaking te reo. These sorts of things did happen, and we're moving into a good space with the use of te reo. Who cares if the Ministry of Culture and Heritage is also known as Manatu Taonga? And when you think about it, Te Papa's been called Te Papa since it opened, and I don't even think it has an English term. These changes are petty and unnecessary and contribute to the feeling of hostility on the part of many Maori. John Key is right. He told the National Party at its conference a couple of months ago to tone down this stuff. And I don't think he would have tolerated David Seymour's bill for a minute. I have a feeling, and I know what he did with the Kermadex legislation, because I was in his office, and he said, well, the Maori Party is going to pull out of the coalition, or the confidence and supply arrangement. He said, that bill's going nowhere. And that's what he would do with the legislation. I could almost imagine him saying it, David, this bill's not going to proceed. And if Seymour had a tantrum and said he'd go to the crossbenches, John would have responded along the lines of something like, well, do whatever you like, but you need to know that I'll personally stand against you in Epsom and I will destroy you. John just didn't take prisoners. And frankly, we've got to bring an end to this treaty principles idiocy as quickly as possible. The second topic, and I'm conscious that, like Mrs. Thatcher, I could go on and on and on until the men in grey suits did her in. I want to say something about Parliament and the judiciary, because I think there's a deteriorating relationship here, and I don't think it's a very good look for Parliament to be dealing with the MACA reforms at the very time that the Supreme Court's dealing with the first big appeal. And there used to be, the Ngāti Whātua Orake case talks about mutual respect and mutual restraint, but you're not seeing a lot of it at the moment. There's always going to be tension between the branches of government, and I've already referred to the way Parliament responded to the decision of the Supreme Court and Lee and the Attorney-General when, with respect, the Supreme Court got it completely wrong on parliamentary privilege. So what's causing the problem? One automatically does blame the political class for not showing judges enough respect. Commentators like Sir Geoffrey Palmer have always proclaimed that the judiciary is the safest branch of government. Well, that's not right at all. There's no safe branch of government. All the branches have to act with circumspection, respect, and recognise boundaries. There is admittedly a slight tendency on the part of senior courts these days to read down legislation. The current approach, or this new approach to statutory interpretation that gets me from time to time, is this can't possibly have been the intention of Parliament, and interpret the bill as they think fit. If judges do move too far into being political operators, then the political class is going to react. Judges may not like a legislative provision, but it's not for them to ignore very clear statutory language. I have concerns about the Waitangi Tribunal, because for some years it's been acting outside its original mandate. It has a tendency to play politics, and I refer you to my example over to Turi Whenua, which I said had the ability to make a major contribution to the economy. What were the key aspects of that reform? First, decisions about Maori land should be made by a majority of engaged owners, not simply owners. The antediluvian registration system needed to be updated to provide Maori with the same quality regulatory service as the land transfer system provides. Dispute resolution procedures needed updating, and as James will know, the High Court rules, you will know the High Court rules were updated in 1984 to modernise civil procedure in the country, and the idea was the judge should no longer micromanage cases, but let parties get on with it and intervene only where necessary, and I was keen to see those reforms in the Maori Land Court. They were very worthwhile reforms. A huge amount of policy work was undertaken by John Grant in particular. The MLC judges were opposed to the reforms. They adopted a political stance. They published articles on the MLC website attacking the reforms. They needed to be told by someone whose name I better not mention to take them down. Some MLC staff complained to the tribunal, but that was essentially a stitch-up. While Maori Land Court judges didn't sit on that particular tribunal, the tribunal still criticised the lack of consultation, which was wrong. Never before had a legislative reform had such a comprehensive consultation. As Attorney General, moreover, I authorised the publication of exposure drafts to enable consultation to be more effective. It was probably the most consulted on and carefully drafted piece of legislation in my career. That notwithstanding, the tribunal was critical and that involvement in politics by the judiciary was inappropriate and unconstitutional. Judges should not be seeking support for opposition from opposition MPs. The tribunal needs reform which goes beyond the appointment of new members. Some members are highly excited by the appointment of Richard Prebble to the tribunal. It will mean nothing. Some years ago I appointed Paul Swain, the former Labour MP for Rimataka, really good fellow. He was a Crown negotiator for me, particularly in Taranaki. I thought he'd make an excellent contribution. In his 5 years on the tribunal, the presiding chair never appointed him to one hearing. The tendency was always to appoint those who could be relied on to be supportive of the presiding judge, and the same thing's going to happen to Prebble. So don't hold your breath. The tribunal's done some very important work over the years, particularly in the historical area, but the time has come for a number of important reforms. I think it needs to be chaired by a former senior High Court judge. Its membership needs to be much what it was like when the tribunal started. People like Paul Tem, John Kneebone, eminent New Zealanders, from Georgina Tehuhu, from various areas, with various areas of expertise who can be relied on to write wise reports in the public interest, and the tribunal administration needs to be radically reformed. Another example of where the tribunal acted politically was in relation to the Whakatohea report published in 2018. It specifically criticised me for the work I've been doing with Whakatohea, said I was pushing those negotiations along for political reasons, and that was simply just plain wrong. I'd been working with Whakatohea for 7 years, and when they indicated to me that some of their internal disputes were resolved, I was very happy, even in an election year, to try and move toward a settlement. Indeed, I'd been criticised on the Pai by Tuku Morgan a year or so earlier for not giving Whakatohea negotiations priority. So if the tribunal wants to play politics, they run the risk of undermining the important work it undertakes. Inevitably, there is going to be pushback from politicians. I don't think that appointing a few new members is going to be sufficient. I think wholesale reform is required. As I said, there's always going to be tension between Parliament, the executive and the judiciary. Sometimes that tension's a good thing, but we need to be very careful that it doesn't go too far and create a crisis. And as I say, there are signs that we could be heading in that direction. There are many other topics I could address, but I've chosen the ones I've talked about tonight because I have some real anxiety that things aren't going too well. I cannot really understand why these punitive and negative policies towards tangata whenua need to be pursued. As I see things, as I've said, the growth of te reo is fantastic. We in this country are all in this project together. Tangata whenua are not the enemy. As I've endeavoured to show with both Rangitane and Rokawa, these people are outstanding contributors to their community and to the long-term economic and social prospects of their whānau. Much of what is happening for Maori appears to be mean-spirited, petty and hurtful. It won't achieve anything. We need to be far more optimistic about this country and recognise the contribution that everyone has to make. The world was plunged into chaos in 1914 and very few people saw it coming. Even when war was declared, everyone thought it would be over soon. In 1914, very few people could have foretold the outcome of World War I, the destruction of 3 empires, 2 of them, the Romanov and the Habsburg one, very ancient, the foundations being laid for the rise of extremism, and another conflagration some years later. Lives ruined, opportunities missed, foolishness and carnage. Now, I'm not saying that this is the inevitable fate for New Zealand if we're not careful. I doubt whether we'll have a civil war. But the point of this address, unlike the Americans, but the point of this address and the reference to the concept of the precipice is to illustrate that in some areas we're not in a good space, and all players need to be very careful not to go too far. They also need to be aware that what may seem to be little steps of no confidence can have devastating consequences. I'm fond of saying, as I said in both my first and last speeches in Parliament, that some countries have problems. New Zealand has a project. It's a project that will challenge people from time to time. It will irritate people, but that's no bad thing. We should be the best little country on earth. We can do better in the areas I've been talking about tonight. We can do better than we're doing at the moment. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou, taka wingo ma. Tompkins way, and I have the task of moderating questions, and so I'd like you to think about some of the questions we might like to ask Chris, and I will just make a couple of comments so that you've got a chance to think and ask him a question yourself. I was pleased, Chris, that you clarified that. And it shows the maturity of Tauranga now that Macca doesn't mean the golden arches on the corner of Wellington. We can have an erudite discussion about that in Tauranga these days. And I was reflecting on the situation we had with KiwiRail and the ferries, and as wondering whether perhaps Raukawa and Rangatani would be better to take over. So one question I have for you in relation to the courts and Parliament's relationship sort of comes on the heels of New Zealand Initiative's discussion recently on that very issue, and the decision in the Ellis case in which Justice Willie Young was the dissenting judge, and the proposition that the Tikanga decision has overturned long-standing rules of how customary law is incorporated into our law and not left a framework to replace it. So I don't know if you'd like to comment on those particular criticisms of the Supreme Court's decision and its potential to undermine parliamentary sovereignty.
Oh, well, that decision could have been reached without reference to tikanga. But the problem I have with the decision is that the Mackay Committee on Defamation looked very closely at reform of the law of defamation in the early 1990s. And one of the things they specifically looked at was whether or not there could be an ability on the part of the executors of an estate or family members to seek a declaration, not damages, a declaration that a deceased person had been defamed. And for some reason, I asked Doug Graham, who was Minister of Justice at the time, why he didn't legislate for that, and he couldn't remember, but it never got into the Defamation Act 1992. So I think it's an area which is probably it's an idea whose time has come, but it's not for the judges to make law. It really should have been for Parliament to look at it as part of any reforms to the Defamation Act. That's the way I do it. But the other point is, I think, if you were going to go down that path, you could have got to a particular end without reliance on TICO. That's the way I see it. But I just think there are some areas that, and I always recall Justice Tipping in relation to limitation, which is one of the reasons I was so keen on reform of limitation. He said in relation to the Limitation Act in a case, this legislation is so hopeless that the courts can't do anything more with it. The legislature has to deal with it. And that's why, under the chairmanship of Justice Blanchard, Geoffrey Palmer, who was president of the Law Commission, put together a group to reform the Limitation Act.
It was actually the Fitzgerald case when Willie Young was the dissenting judge.
Willie Young was the dissenting judge in the Fitzgerald case and in the Waikato case, because he said that the very carefully drafted privative clause in the Te Tauihu claim settlement legislation meant what it said, and the majority had a slightly different view.
So we've got some more questions from my and ask a question. What about some of the plans of staff?
You said quite clearly you don't believe the treaty principles should or will go forward. I just wanted you to comment on the view that the real damage there is not potential for legislation, it's emboldening people who hold anti-Māori views and the impact that will have on our society.
Oh, yeah, well, it will go ahead. As I understand, it's going to be introduced toward the end of the year. It will go to a select committee hearing. It will be destroyed by submission, and then it will die. But it's the damage that's done. I don't know whether you see it in the university, but I certainly see it out there, and I'm not going to give you too much graphic detail, but in recent years, maybe it's post-COVID, I don't know. But people feel liberated to express themselves in rather unpleasant terms. One Sunday, I was just sort of wandering along Willa Street towards Superior of the Angels, and someone walked past me and said, effing lawyer, and made some vile remark about Maori. And a few days later, I was in the Canterbury Club, of all places, and someone came up to me and clearly inebriated, called me a loser, and all I've ever done is apologise to Maori, and why don't I get lost? And so people have always held those views about me, some of them totally justifiable, but you know, you've got, I just see there's this real anger out there, and people, and of course there are the keyboard warriors who express themselves. And so we've got a cheapening of discourse, and we just need to not to allow too much license for that sort of thing to continue. Of course, what we're seeing in the United States is sort of the apotheosis of vulgarity. People calling, one guy a fascist, and his comments are disgraceful. And you've got a cheapening of political discourse there, which is part and parcel of American politics. I mean, if you go back to Grover Cleveland's time, I am a nerd, what was the great campaign? Ma, ma, where's my pa? Gone to the White House, ha, 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 because Grover Cleveland had a child outside of wedlock. So, I mean, it's always been cheap over there. But and there have always been some rather unpleasant specimens here with Muldoon and others, but by and large, people we've reined it in, and but I'm seeing a deterioration in that regard. So it's not the bill; it's the collateral damage that's caused.
I agree with your thesis about Precipice, and I see the pessimism. My question to you is, can you see a tipping point?
I am worried about the treaty principles bill. I'm worried about MACA. There are a lot of little things that pinprick at people, but there are some bigger issues as well. And you see, in me, I have enough confidence to know that the Treaty Principles Bill is nonsense and can be defeated by power of argument. But that is not, and I'm not arrogant enough to purport to speak for my tangata whenua friends, but it's not how it's being received. And so I think that I'd kill it stone dead now.
Thank you for a really insightful speech. Respectfully, I'm not sure I agree with you in terms of reform of the Waitangi Negotiations. In Māori, I feel like that's probably one of the safest spaces that we can go to be heard. So when you talk about reform, what do you mean by reform?
Oh, well, the work that's done in the historical area has been superb. It's and clearly the tribunal continues and will continue forever to have a role. Shutting down the tribunal is impossible. But I have a particular beef about the way they dealt with the Te Ture Whenua reform, and I thought that the work they did was suboptimal and criticised process in a way that was totally unfair and didn't really get to the heart of what the reform was all about. And I think there have been other instances where that has happened. And so my preference would be to see a smaller group of people appointed to the tribunal, as I said, the very wise people who it started with, and get back to that original notion that Matt Rata had for the tribunal in 1975.
Just going back I think they spent about $7 million going around the country in talking to Māori about the reform of the Te Ture Whenua Māori Land Act. It was clear that Māori had a problem with it. I think to say that, I just think that, well, there was consulted and we did have a problem with it. I'm not sure that shelving it was the answer, that to denigrate the whole process and say, well, you know, it should have had a better outcome. Well, it was what it was, wasn't it?
Well, you and I will have different views on it. I was appointed Associate Minister of Maori Affairs in 2011 and began a 6-year reform process. And Te Ururoa was involved, and he was targeted, particularly in this area in 2017, that it was going to be another form of confiscation. Total, utter nonsense. The Te Ture Whenua reform was not about confiscation of Maori land. It was about providing a better service to Maori. And why shouldn't Te Ture Whenua or the whenua have the same standards of registration and dispute resolution that general land systems have? That's what it was all about. And so that people who own the land could get access to the land. And I was particularly uptight about the question of landlocked land after the mayor of Rangitikei came and saw me and told me about, and brought a guy along, and he said, I wanted to get access to the whānau land, which was landlocked. And the farmer said, yeah, walk on. Oh, I need vehicular access. Get jumped on. See you in court. And so that issue needed to be looked at. Landlocked land is a form of, well, we all know what landlocked land is. It's de facto confiscation. So there were those sorts of issues that we were trying to grapple with. And I'm sorry, but my view is the tribunal got it wrong.
Thank you so much for your talk. What do you make of this talk around the campfire? And forgive me, I might be quite ignorant about this. I'm only just learning about the law, but talk around the campfire
there may be a attempt to try and do a citizens-initiated referendum on the same thing. Is that a possibility?
Well, I suppose we've had citizens-initiated referenda on a variety of things over the years. Was compulsory super one? Battery hens? I'd put it, in the category of battery hens. But I mean, you're quite right. It could happen, and God help us if it does, because you'd really unleash some pretty, my little exchange of pleasantries with people wandering up towards St Mary's would be chicken feed compared with what we would have in this country, and it would be corrosive, unpleasant, extreme, and do immense damage to our social fabric. Well, you're absolutely correct, and I always laugh when I hear the term Maori privilege because it's an oxymoron. And it comes back to my point about the Raukawas and the Rangitanes. They are providing services throughout the community. Ngāti Toa in Porirua East is another one, doing fabulous work with the Pacifica community as well. And it's not a question of, we'll look after our lot and the rest can, put up with things as best they can. It is, they are there for the community. And that's why, we can be so proud of what's happening and rejoice in many of these contemporary developments, and just this other stuff can only upset the apple cart unnecessarily.
I think that's
We can hear you.
Your concern about potential precipice for New Zealand society is significant evidence at the moment that a high proportion of the population feel that they're effectively excluded from having any effective voice in decisions that are taken either at the level of central government or through local government. And when one looks at the way political parties, for example, have evolved over the past few years, it seems clear that increasingly the major political parties are run in order to keep other voices out, rather than to say we're an open membership, our policies are determined by our membership as a whole. And from my perspective, the inability to renew our democracy so that people feel that their voices count and that one person, one vote really means something is part of the problem that we have to address, and I'd welcome your comment on that.
I think it's very, what you say about political parties is true. I joined the National Party fresh out of school in 1975, and I was a member of the Karori electorate, and it had about 6,000 members, and I worked in the Kandala branch, which had 1,000 members, and it was a broad-based party. And I don't know what the membership is now, but I can tell you it's substantially reduced on that, and so the perception is, in some circles, and it applies to the Labour Party as well, that they're not reaching out to sufficient numbers of people, and you've got an ever-decreasing number of people who have enormous sway, actually, when it comes to the selection of MPs. And I mean, but it's not just a problem here; it's a problem the world over. I mean, look at the state of the Conservative Party. Only the Conservative Party, in a really advanced state of decay, would have selected Liz Truss as their leader. And the lettuce lasted longer than her. So and look at the state of the Republican and Democratic parties. I mean, it's a worldwide phenomenon. At the end of the day, I would say people need, you can sit on the outside complaining, looking in, or you can get involved, try and change it.